March 1944. Darkness over northern Germany. A Luftwaffe night fighter pilot climbs through 15,000 feet hunting British bombers in his Messerschmitt Bf-110. His Liechtenstein radar glows faintly in the cockpit, his technological edge in the blackness. He's experienced, 37 kills. He's confident. He's hunting. But tonight, he doesn't know that he's also being hunted. Behind him, silent and invisible, a de Havilland Mosquito NF Mark II closes the distance at 370 miles per hour. The British crew watches the Germans' radar emissions on their own screen, a revolutionary technology called Serrate. The Mosquito pilot throttles forward smoothly. His navigator calls the range, 800 yards, 600 yards, 400 yards. The German pilot never suspects a thing. He's focused on the bomber stream ahead, adjusting his course, preparing for an interception. He never looks behind. The Mosquito closes to 200 yards. The pilot centers the glowing blip on his gun sight. 4 Hispano 20mm cannons erupt in a roaring burst. Shells tear through the Bf-110's fuselage, shredding metal, fuel tanks, and flesh. The German aircraft disintegrates in a massive fireball that lights the night sky for 3 full seconds. No parachute, no radio call, no warning. Just instant, violent death from above. The Mosquito banks away smoothly, disappearing back into the darkness. Another kill confirmed. Another German night fighter crew that will never return home. Another name added to the growing list of Luftwaffe losses. This wasn't a rare occurrence. This wasn't luck. This was becoming routine. And for the Luftwaffe's once dominant night fighter force, it was a nightmare they couldn't solve, couldn't escape, and couldn't survive. By mid-1943, the night sky over Germany belonged to the Luftwaffe. At least, that's what they believed. RAF Bomber Command had been pounding German cities relentlessly for 2 years, sending hundreds of Lancasters and Halifaxes into the darkness night after night. The cost in British lives was staggering. German night fighters, equipped with radar, guided by ground controllers, flown by experienced crews, were slaughtering RAF bombers by the dozen. In some raids, losses exceeded 10%. Entire squadrons were decimated in single nights. Bomber crews didn't expect to survive a full tour of 30 operations. The statistical odds were brutally simple. You would probably die. The German night defense system was devastatingly effective. It was sophisticated, layered, and lethal. Würzburg ground radar stations tracked incoming bomber streams from the moment they crossed the coast. Controllers vectored night fighters into position, guiding them toward the bomber formations with precise instructions. Once the fighters were close enough, their onboard Liechtenstein radar took over, allowing them to lock on to individual bombers from up to 2 miles away. The rest was mechanical. Close to 200 yards, fire a burst from 20 or 30mm cannons, watch the bomber explode or spiral down in flames. British Lancasters and Halifaxes were large, slow, and packed with fuel and high explosives. A single well-placed burst could turn them into falling pyres visible for miles. German night fighter aces racked up staggering kill counts. Helmut Lent had over 100 confirmed kills. Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer would eventually claim 121. These weren't just numbers. They were British boys burning alive at 20,000 feet. But the RAF didn't accept this slaughter passively. British intelligence, engineers, and strategists began to think differently. If German night fighters ruled the darkness through technology and tactics, then the British would turn those same advantages against them. They wouldn't just defend their bombers. They would hunt the hunters. Not defensively, not reactively, offensively, aggressively. They would turn the Luftwaffe's own night into a killing ground for them. And the weapon they chose for this mission was the de Havilland Mosquito. And it would change everything. The de Havilland Mosquito wasn't just another aircraft. It was a revolution wrapped in plywood, balsa, and twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Originally designed as a high-speed, unarmed bomber that could outrun enemy fighters, it evolved into something far more lethal, the deadliest night fighter of the entire war. The NF Mark II variant, introduced in late 1942, was purpose-built for nocturnal combat. It carried AI Mark IV airborne interception radar in the nose, 4 20mm Hispano cannons mounted in the belly, and 4.33 Browning machine guns in the nose. It was fast, over 370 miles per hour at altitude, faster than any German night fighter. It was agile, capable of outturning the heavier Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Junkers Ju-88s. And it was flown by some of the RAF's most experienced and aggressive crews. But raw performance wasn't the Mosquito's only advantage. The real game-changer was a piece of technology called Serrate. Serrate was a passive radar detection system that homed in on emissions from German Liechtenstein radar sets. When a Luftwaffe night fighter switched on its radar to hunt British bombers, it unknowingly broadcast its own position to any Serrate-equipped Mosquito within range. The Germans didn't know this initially. They assumed their radar transmissions were invisible to the enemy, that their technological edge was secure and uncompromised. They were catastrophically wrong.
RAF 141 Squadron pioneered the operational use of Serrate-equipped Mosquitoes starting in mid-1943. Their mission was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. Follow the bomber stream deep into German airspace, use Serrate to locate enemy night fighters as they hunted, close in silently using superior speed, and destroy them with cannon fire. These operations were called Intruder missions. The Mosquitoes weren't there to defend bombers directly by staying close to the formations. They were there to stalk, hunt, and kill the predators. The psychological effect on German night fighter crews was immediate, profound, and catastrophic. For 2 years, German night fighter pilots had operated with near total confidence. They owned the night. They climbed into the bomber stream, switched on their Liechtenstein radar, locked on to targets methodically, and fired with practiced precision. It was professional, clinical, deadly efficient. Many pilots had dozens of kills. Some approached triple digits. They were the elite of the Luftwaffe, respected, decorated, and feared by Allied aircrews. Then the Mosquitoes arrived, and everything changed overnight. Suddenly, the simple act of turning on your radar, the cornerstone of your entire tactical system, became potentially suicidal. German pilots began to realize with growing horror that the moment they activated their Liechtenstein sets, they might have mere seconds left to live. Mosquitoes were faster than their Bf-110s by a significant margin. They could outturn the heavier Ju-88s with ease. And they struck without any warning whatsoever. No radar return, no engine noise audible over the bomber's din, just sudden cannon fire and explosive death. Luftwaffe night fighter ace Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, who would survive the war as Germany's highest-scoring night fighter pilot, later described the creeping terror that gripped his comrades. We could not see them, we could not hear them coming. We only knew they were there when our wingmen exploded beside us in the darkness. The fear spread like a contagion through night fighter units. Pilots began to hesitate before activating their radar, weighing the tactical advantage against the mortal risk. Some flew entirely passive, attempting to visually spot bombers against the stars, a nearly impossible task in the pitch darkness of a clouded night. Others refused to climb into the densest parts of the bomber stream, orbiting cautiously at safer distances, hoping desperately to avoid the invisible Mosquitoes. Unit morale began to crack, then crumble. The psychological dominance the Luftwaffe had enjoyed for 2 years was evaporating. But the nightmare was only beginning. because the Mosquito crews weren't satisfied with hunting over the bomber streams. They took the war directly to the enemy's doorstep. Mosquito Intruder squadrons began conducting what can only be described as aerial ambush missions over Luftwaffe night fighter airfields themselves. They would follow the bomber stream into Germany, then peel away and orbit near known night fighter airfields, Leeuwarden, Venlo, Gilze-Rijen, and dozens of others. They waited in the circuit, invisible in the total darkness, engines throttled back to reduce noise, and they watched. German night fighters, after completing their missions, would return to base exhausted, low on fuel, ammunition expended. The pilots were focused on landing safely, eager to get out of the aircraft and debrief. They switched on navigation lights to signal the tower. They lowered landing gear and extended flaps. They descended on final approach, vulnerable and defenseless. That's when the Mosquitoes struck. The attacks were merciless. German pilots were shot down on final approach, gear down, flaps out, unable to maneuver. Some exploded just short of the runway, crashing in fireballs visible to their own ground crews. Others were caught in the landing circuit, banking gently to align with the runway, oblivious to the death closing from behind. A few were destroyed actually on the runway itself, taxiing slowly after touchdown, believing they were safe. Ground crews watched in helpless horror as their comrades, men they'd worked with for months or years, were murdered within sight of safety. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into the darkness, hoping to hit something, anything. They rarely did. The Mosquitoes attacked, killed, and vanished back into the night before effective countermeasures could be organized. This was psychological warfare at its most brutal and effective. German pilots couldn't relax even over their own territory, over their own airfields, in their own landing circuits. There was no safe moment, no sanctuary. The stress became unbearable. Some pilots reported their hands shaking as they lowered their landing gear, wondering if this would be the night a Mosquito was waiting for them. Landings became lotteries of survival. Flight Lieutenant Bob Bram, who was one of the RAF's highest-scoring night fighter aces, exemplified the Mosquito crew's aggression and skill. On a single sortie in June 1943, his Mosquito shot down a Bf-110 over Holland, then immediately stalked and destroyed a Ju-88 minutes later near the German border. Both kills were confirmed by ground observers and subsequent wreckage recovery. His aircraft returned to England without a single hit. It wasn't luck. It was superior technology, superior tactics, and superior execution. Squadron leader Brands Burbridge, who would eventually become the RAF's highest-scoring night fighter pilot, with 21 confirmed kills, perfected the art of the night ambush. His tactics were surgical in their precision. Close to 200 yards using radar guidance, fire a short, controlled burst from the 4 cannons, visually confirm the kill, then immediately move to search for the next target. No wasted ammunition, no hesitation, no mercy. Just cold, professional killing.
The Luftwaffe tried desperately to adapt. Engineers experimented with different radar frequencies, hoping to evade Serrate detection. They installed primitive rearward-facing warning receivers to alert pilots if they were being tracked. Commanders issued strict orders to minimize radar use and switch off all unnecessary lights. Tactical procedures were rewritten. Training was intensified. Nothing worked. The Mosquitoes kept coming, and they kept killing. The Mosquitoes' dominance wasn't accidental. It was the result of superior engineering, innovative tactics, and technological advantages that the Germans simply couldn't counter effectively with their existing equipment. Serrate Mk1 had a detection range of approximately 50 miles under ideal conditions, far beyond the effective range of German Liechtenstein AI radar, which maxed out at about 2 miles. This gave Mosquito crews an enormous tactical advantage. They could detect a German night fighter long before it had any idea they were in the area. Once Serrate picked up an emission, The Mosquito navigator would guide the pilot toward the signal source using precise heading corrections. As they closed to within 2 miles, the Mosquito's own AI Mk4 radar would acquire the target, allowing a final precise approach from directly astern, the German crew's blind spot. The Mosquito crew operated as a perfectly synchronized team. The pilot controlled the aircraft and fired the weapons. The navigator operated both radar systems, called out ranges and closing speeds, monitored surrounding airspace, and often spotted visual confirmation of the target. It required exceptional skill, absolute coordination under stress, and nerves of steel. But when executed correctly by an experienced crew, it was almost impossible for the German aircraft to survive. German night fighters were fundamentally outmatched. The Bf-110G, the most common type, had a maximum speed of about 340 miles per hour, 30 miles per hour slower than the Mosquito. It carried devastating Schrage-Musik upward-firing cannons mounted behind the cockpit, angled at 70 degrees, perfect for approaching British bombers from below and raking their undefended bellies with cannon fire. But against a Mosquito attacking from directly behind or above at higher speed, completely useless. The Bf-110 couldn't outrun, outclimb, or outturn the Mosquito. The U-88 was slightly faster than the Bf-110, capable of about 360 miles per hour in the later G-series variants, but it was still marginally slower than the Mosquito and far less maneuverable. The HE-219 Uhu, potentially the only German night fighter that could match the Mosquito's performance, was produced in pathetically small numbers, fewer than 300 total, and never equipped enough units to make a strategic difference. The Mosquito's wooden construction provided an unexpected additional advantage. Metal aircraft reflected radar energy efficiently, making them relatively easy to detect. Wood absorbed and scattered radar waves, giving the Mosquito a significantly smaller radar cross-section than its size would suggest. Combined with its high speed, this made successful interception by German forces almost impossible. Even when German controllers detected a Mosquito on their Wurzburg sets and vectored fighters toward it, the Mosquito could simply accelerate away into the darkness, untouchable. In every measurable category — speed, climb rate, maneuverability, radar technology, firepower concentration, and crew training — the Mosquito was superior. The Germans were fighting at a fundamental disadvantage, and they knew it. By early 1944, the situation had deteriorated so severely that Luftwaffe High Command was forced to issue an extraordinary directive. Night fighter pilots were explicitly forbidden from switching on their Liechtenstein radar or external navigation lights except in cases of absolute emergency or direct orders from ground control. They were instructed to rely exclusively on visual identification and ground-controlled vectoring. Read that again. The entire German night fighter system, years in development, billions of Reichsmarks invested, trained at enormous cost in lives and resources, was built on radar-guided interception. It was the foundation of their tactical doctrine. And now, their own high command was ordering pilots not to use it. This wasn't a tactical adjustment. This was an admission of total, catastrophic failure. Without radar, night fighters were essentially blind in the darkness. Visual identification of bombers at night was extraordinarily difficult under the best conditions, nearly impossible in clouds, haze, or moonless nights. Interception rates plummeted immediately. RAF bomber losses dropped noticeably. Mosquito kill rates remained high because German night fighters still had to operate, still had to try to defend their cities, and every time they did, they risked running into the waiting hunters. The psychological impact of this order cannot be overstated. Imagine being told that your primary weapon, the technology that gives you any hope of surviving and succeeding, is now forbidden because using it will get you killed. The message was clear and unmistakable. The British have beaten us. We cannot fight them effectively. All we can do is try to hide and hope they don't find us. German ace Havilland Lent, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced and successful night fighter pilots with over 100 confirmed kills, reportedly told his squadron in a brutally honest briefing, "The Mosquito is the only aircraft in this war that we cannot fight effectively. We cannot catch it. We cannot outmaneuver it. We can only pray they don't see us first." That was the reality facing the Luftwaffe in early 1944. The night sky, their domain, their advantage, their killing ground for 2 years, now belonged to the enemy. And there was nothing they could do about it. Between mid-1943 and mid-1944, a span of approximately 9 months, RAF Mosquito Intruder squadrons destroyed an estimated 258 Luftwaffe night fighters in aerial combat. These were confirmed kills, aircraft positively identified as destroyed, either seen exploding in mid-air, observed crashing and burning on the ground, or abandoned by parachuting crews. The true number, including probable kills and aircraft so heavily damaged they crashed later or were written off, was almost certainly significantly higher. Conservative estimates place the total impact at over 300 German night fighters removed from operational service. 258 confirmed kills, that number represents not just machines lost, it represents irreplaceable human capital. Experienced radar operators who understood the complex systems, veteran pilots with hundreds of hours of night flying experience, men who had survived years of brutal combat, accumulated dozens of kills, and formed the irreplaceable backbone of Germany's night defense infrastructure. Each loss was a blow the Luftwaffe could not afford and could not replace. The effect on Luftwaffe night fighter operations was absolutely catastrophic. Units reported collapsing morale, pilots refusing to fly, and experienced crews requesting immediate transfers to day fighter units, despite those units suffering even higher casualty rates against American escort fighters. Some night fighter Geschwadra suffered 40% losses in a matter of weeks. Replacement crews arrived undertrained, terrified by the stories they'd heard, and died quickly. The carefully built organizational structure began to fracture under the strain. Individual Mosquito aces racked up extraordinary scores. Bob Bram finished the war with 29 confirmed kills, many against German night fighters over occupied Europe. Brand's Burbridge's 21 kills were achieved almost entirely during Intruder operations. John Cunningham, Britain's first radar-equipped night fighter ace, added multiple German night fighters to his total while flying Mosquitoes over Holland and Germany. These weren't just numbers on a scorecard, they were German crews who would never threaten British bombers again. Meanwhile, RAF bomber losses, while still painful and significant, began to stabilize and then gradually decline. The Mosquito intruders weren't the only factor, of course. Window chaff disrupted German radar, improved bomber tactics spread formations out, long-range P-51 Mustangs provided daylight escort. But the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's night fighter force by Mosquito hunters was undeniably a major contributing factor. The predators had been culled, and the bombers were safer as a direct result. By summer 1944, Luftwaffe night fighter units existed largely in name only. They had aircraft, German factories continued producing Bf-110s and U-88s until near the end of the war, but they lacked experienced crews. They lacked effective tactics. They lacked confidence. They lacked the will to aggressively engage. Most critically, they lacked any solution to the Mosquito problem. They were beaten, and every pilot knew it. By mid-1944, particularly after the Allied invasion of Normandy in June, the Luftwaffe's night fighter force was a hollow shell of its former strength. Remaining operational units flew cautiously, avoided risky engagements whenever possible, and struggled to inflict any meaningful losses on RAF bomber streams. The psychological advantage had shifted entirely. Now it was German pilots who feared the darkness, who wondered if every mission would be their last, who looked constantly over their shoulders. The introduction of even more advanced Mosquito variants made the situation completely hopeless.
The Mosquito NF Mark X-17 and later marks carried centimetric AI Mark X radar, operating on entirely different frequencies that existing German warning receivers couldn't detect at all. German pilots could no longer tell if a mosquito was tracking them. Every moment in the air became a gamble with death. Mosquito Intruder Squadrons 141, 169, 239, 515, and others continued operations through the end of the war with relentless efficiency. They ranged deep into Germany, hunting over Berlin itself, prowling the circuits of airfields across occupied Europe. Some crews destroyed 5, 6, even 7 German aircraft during a single operational tour. The Mosquito's reputation became legendary on both sides. German pilots feared it more intensely than any other Allied aircraft, not because it carried devastating bomb loads like the Lancaster, but because it hunted them personally, individually, relentlessly. One captured Luftwaffe officer, interrogated by British intelligence in April 1945, provided perhaps the most telling assessment of the Mosquito's psychological impact. Your heavy bombers destroyed our cities and killed our civilians. We could understand that. It was war. But your Mosquitoes destroyed our ability to fight back. They killed our defenders. They made us afraid to defend our own homeland. Your Mosquitoes destroyed our will. That statement encapsulates the Mosquito's strategic achievement. It wasn't just about kill counts or loss ratios. It was about breaking the enemy's spirit, making them fear their own tactics, forcing them to abandon their advantages. It was about psychological dominance translating into operational paralysis. Post-war historical analysis, drawing from both Allied and German records, confirms the devastating scale of Mosquito successes against Luftwaffe night fighters. German loss records, meticulously maintained even as the Reich collapsed, cross-referenced with RAF combat reports and operational summaries, verify the numbers. Luftwaffe night fighter operational strength, which peaked at over 800 aircraft in mid-1943, had collapsed to fewer than 400 combat-ready machines by mid-1944. The shortfall was in trained crews, not airframes.
Crew losses were even more catastrophic than aircraft losses. Experienced night fighter aces, men whose names had been celebrated in German propaganda, who wore the Knight's Cross, who had survived hundreds of combat missions, were killed in action during this period, many specifically by Mosquitoes. Reinhard Kollack, Paul Gildner, August Geiger, and dozens of other high-scoring pilots died in the night skies over Germany and occupied Europe between 1943 and 1945. RAF operational research documents showed that Mosquito Intruder squadrons achieved kill-to-loss ratios consistently exceeding 10-to-1 during night operations over Europe. Some squadrons, during particular operational periods, reported ratios above 15-to-1. These figures are extraordinary in the context of Second World War aerial combat, where even a 3-to-1 ratio was considered excellent performance. For context, the much-celebrated Supermarine Spitfire achieved average kill-to-loss ratios of approximately 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 during the Battle of Britain. The Mosquito's combination of wooden construction, twin Merlin engines providing exceptional power and reliability, advanced radar technology, concentrated forward-firing armament, and superb handling characteristics created what military aviation historians now recognize as one of the most successful and versatile combat aircraft of the entire war. It wasn't the absolute fastest. The later German jets exceeded its speed. It wasn't the heaviest armed. Some aircraft carried larger caliber weapons. But in the specific crucial role of night intruder operations, hunting enemy fighters offensively over their own territory, it was simply unmatched by any aircraft on either side. German night fighter pilots feared the British Mosquito more than American B-17 formations for one fundamental, undeniable reason. The B-17 was a target, large, predictable, and defensive. The Mosquito was a predator, fast, aggressive, and absolutely lethal. American daylight raids were dangerous for German fighters, certainly,
The B-17s flew in tight defensive boxes, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns from every angle. They were escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that aggressively engaged German interceptors. Attacking a B-17 formation required courage and skill, and many German pilots died trying. But the Americans followed generally predictable routes toward strategic targets. German controllers could track them on radar from takeoff. Interception could be planned. Pilots could choose when and how to engage based on tactical situation, fuel state, and ammunition remaining. They could break off if the situation became unfavorable. They had options. They had some measure of control. Against the Mosquito, there were no options, no control, no choice. The Mosquito found you first, guided by your own radar emissions. It closed faster than you could possibly escape, even at full throttle. It attacked without any warning. No radar return, no visual sighting, just sudden cannon fire tearing through your aircraft. And if you somehow survived the first attack pass, it would pursue you relentlessly, chasing you down with superior speed and climb rate, hunting you until you died. There was no hiding from it, no safe altitude where it couldn't reach you, no time of night when you were secure from attack. Even over your own airfield, even on landing approach with gear down and flaps extended, even taxiing on your own runway, the Mosquito could be there, invisible in the darkness, waiting to kill you. That psychological burden, the knowledge that the simple act of doing your job, of switching on the radar that was supposed to protect you might be the last thing you ever did, broke the Luftwaffe's night fighter force more comprehensively than any amount of anti-aircraft fire or electronic jamming ever could. The Mosquito proved a fundamental truth of aerial warfare that remains relevant today. Dominance isn't achieved solely through superior numbers or raw firepower. Psychological supremacy matters just as much, perhaps more. Fear is a weapon. Uncertainty is a weapon. The inability to fight back effectively is demoralizing in ways that physical destruction alone cannot achieve. In the night skies over Germany and occupied Europe from 1943 to 1945, the only thing more terrifying to German defenders than the thousands of tons of bombs falling on their cities was the silent wooden ghost systematically hunting and killing their protectors. The Mosquito crews didn't just fight the Luftwaffe's night fighter force, they made the Luftwaffe afraid to fight back. By the war's end in May 1945, the de Havilland Mosquito had earned a reputation unmatched by virtually any other multi-role aircraft in history. It served with devastating effectiveness as a high-speed bomber, a long-range photo reconnaissance platform, a precision pathfinder, a fighter bomber, and, most psychologically damaging of all, as a night intruder hunting enemy defenders over their own territory. But its most strategically significant role was that nocturnal hunter-killer mission, turning the Luftwaffe's own tactics against them, dismantling their carefully constructed night defense system piece by piece, kill by kill, and replacing German confidence with paralyzing fear. 258 German night fighters confirmed destroyed in just 9 months. Hundreds of experienced, irreplaceable crews lost. A defensive network that once dominated the night sky reduced to paralyzed ineffectiveness. An entire tactical doctrine abandoned because it had become suicidal. And a legend born in the darkness over occupied Europe, a legend of a wooden aircraft crewed by determined men who hunted the hunters and won. The de Havilland Mosquito didn't just outfight the Luftwaffe's night fighter force. It broke them psychologically, operationally, and strategically. It made them fear the very darkness they once controlled. And in doing so, it helped to ensure that RAF Bomber Command could continue its strategic campaign against Nazi Germany, ultimately contributing to the Reich's total collapse. The German night fighter pilots were absolutely right to fear the Mosquito more than any American bomber formation. The Americans could hurt you. The Mosquito hunted you personally, relentlessly, and lethally. It was death wrapped in plywood and powered by Merlin engines, flown by some of the most skilled and aggressive crews in the Royal Air Force. And it owned the night.